Yep.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm the Appalachian American. This is going to be a short series of videos coming at you about the culture war. Discussing it with me tonight is my good friend, Channel Dad Brian Lape.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
And also David Applegate.
G'day.
What we are intending to do with these series of videos is to dive into what the culture war is, historically.
Here we are discussing kind of the historical aspects, what in the world a culture war is, and why it's important for people to understand and to care.
Right.
So
right off the bat, let's dive into the definition of the culture war.
Okay. Since I was yammering, I'll give you my definition and my understanding, I should say. So it's been discussed that what makes a country is language, culture, and borders. And culture is what binds a group of people together. And if you have heavy influence or control over that culture, you invariably, it controls, I should say, how people think, the paradigms that they have those thoughts and create. And so you can influence people quite directly through their culture, the things that hold them together, whether their myths, their legends, their ideas, their stories. You control and influence that, you control the people. David?
I'd like to add to that because culture is actually itself the discourse. It's the agreement and disagreement, the polarization of society, and that culture war are the hot topics. Those are the topics of the day that polarize society. And if you could control that, you could make money because you control what books are printed. And today, what movies get seen, what becomes a blockbuster today, in 10 years' time won't, because if there's a change in the culture. So it's an ongoing process. It's always happening, even if you don't know it.
So what I've often thought, I was totally oblivious to the culture war until mid-teens of like 2015-ish. I really had I'd always known, I think in the back of my mind, I had always known that there was an agenda in normal sitcoms. I don't want to say like where, because just in case we get flagged for something. I do remember in certain sitcoms there were a little bit of elements of, let's make the dad look like an idiot. Let's make the man look stupid.
Yeah.
And that left a wide open gap in young people's minds like me. And I was like, well, I guess guys are just dumb.
It was funny at the time, but it was impressionable youth who didn't understand.
And that's that particular aspect is something that goes back quite a ways. You can go back to radio dramas. The Life of Riley is a prime example. But the ideas, I started becoming aware of some of this in 8th, 9th grade. And it used to express itself in America through what the Democrats want to do versus the Republicans. But we started to have a shift, I'd say, in the 70s, almost as a pushback on the revolutions of the late 60s, the cultural, upheavals, sexual revolution, different things, war in Vietnam, protests. This concept of family values is something that John Wayne used to talk about on talk shows in the mid 70s. So it is not a modern phenomenon, but the aspects I think have intensified over time. So where it used to be maybe we can see each other's opinions. Maybe we still don't agree, but we can agree to disagree. We can have some aspect of live and let live. Now it's very polarizing aspects where a group of people are, even at the highest levels of government, are being labeled quite negatively, and we're seeing some of those ramifications. So I know we want to talk about the historical context. I just want to kind of give a little bit of stuff that I know, and I'll pass the ball over to David to fill in some more details. But in that it's not a modern phenomenon, because culture has always had some level of control, right? Go back to the pharaohs of Egypt. The pharaohs came and went, but the priestly class that developed are the ones that really were the direct aspects of the culture. You had Akhenaten, who changed the culture. They went to a religion of a single god, Aten, and moved the capital and everything, dies, and the priestly class takes over, and they try to erase him from history, right? So so the idea of a figurehead is something that's, I think, very old, but that's essentially why the culture war controls us, because it our culture does define, it shapes our brains, it shapes our paradigms, and good and bad, right? This is just a thing. It's just neutral at this point, that it leads us into where we have. And so when we have upheavals of culture, say the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, rediscovering of classical literature, even in ancient times, the concepts that the Romans came up with, that were able to not just spread their empire, but spread on any of their ideals, the influence on languages, the influence on buildings and architecture that we still see today. We still use things that they developed in many ways. So in many ways, the Romans are still with us, and their culture directly isn't, but their effect on our modern culture is. So I'm going to yield to Dave on that.
The modern culture war was actually born in Germany between 1871 and 1878. Now, it didn't reach the United States until the 1920s. Until the post-war era, the culture wars moved slowly. What Brian, you described, was actually a transition of hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, where in modern times, what was normal for some cultures yesterday has changed. And I don't know if this is because we have mass media, or that more people are paying attention to. We'll actually see as we go on. Now, the Roman era, well, actually the Greco-Roman era, is what our politics of today is still based on. And I think that's the lasting impression. Whereas, and that is culture. How we define ourselves is culture. It's politics, it's religion, because culture is passed on to future generations through stories. And I think that's why we have a culture war, because those who want to sell their stories, they're in positions of power to change the culture to make their stories popular.
Yeah, Ed, I would say, look at how the Romans in some areas, like in Central Europe, there was a bit of a blending, but depending on which side of the Chronicles you want to believe, but when they get to England, they pretty much try to wipe out the Druids for various reasons, which aren't immaterial. But again, it's the concept of controlling the culture to control the populace. This is also why they would, in your foreign legions in England, they may have been from the Middle East somewhere, because it's a foreign culture. They're not going to run away and join the locals. They're going to do their duty, and then if they survive, they can return back when their time is done. They can return back to their own culture. And so that the dichotomy, I guess, that pitting against one another is why it's important if you wish to control a population. I shouldn't say you, but if someone wishes to control a population, and that's why in the modern era aspects of mass media, the internet, why there's such a big push. We have globalists and things that are trying to do this and the like, but again, if they're going to have a direct and heavy influence on the world, they have to control the cultures. Well, the cultures of the world are very vast, but if you get to the language, we have things like hate speech laws and things like these things that self-censor people, and they've moved on to that from that now with energy and food and stuff. But that's why those laws over a couple decades were so important. It was to control the thought and the speech. And the negative side of that is not just getting rid of language that's probably people should grow out of. That means we can't discuss those ideas, and it's harder to instead of bringing those bad ideas into the full, truth, light of truth, and show how bad they are. There's a try of suppression, and that in turn, it's like the kid when you tell a child don't do something, what do? They want to do that, right? So we have these ideas that probably in the light of day could have just died out and just been a historical footnote, and people would understand why those ideas are bad or horrific, where they lead. But instead, we try to suppress, and now we're trying to suppress the concepts of liberty and expression. But that's just a continuation of what started probably in modern times in the 50s with rock and roll, right? Oh, I can't have that. As opposed to allowing it and discussing it openly, we want to. And so then you had the 60s counterculture, right? And unfortunately, there was a lot of drug experimentation, things that came along with that. And I think that attempt to censor is in part drove it underground, and it drove some of that behavior with it, and it had an impact on the culture that for a while we had to deal with and had to get over. And in some ways we still do as a culture, because we still have a massive drug problem, right? In other words, like, these things can continue, and we try to hide it, and we don't want to bring it out. And again, in modern time, it's if I can get you to censor yourself by whatever that means, get you not to express ideas that I find offensive is a bit strong, but I find I don't wish to be expressed, then now I have control over someone else without actually being there to do it. And the culture is how you can do that, right? I'm not standing next to them smacking them every time they say something I don't like. It's I've put enough pressure through the culture on someone that they won't express it for out of fear.
Basically, the culture war is a passive-aggressive attempt at mind control or groupthink. Orwell summed it up best. Wrongthink is the crime which they want to popularize.
That makes sense because, back when I was a kid watching TV, I mean, that was the big thing. That was what we did as a family. We sat around, watched movies, TV shows. There was, all your sitcoms, your, just your back in the 90s was sitcom era. I mean, it was super popular. That was your Monday, your Friday night specials, your prime time. Well, when I was probably 1996, 97, I think I was 7, 8 years old. That's when I realized, man, they sure are making the guy look a little stupid. They sure are trying to prop up, certain things and certain ideologies. There was ways that you could see things being said and portrayed, and you could see the way they were pushing the light on the characters and writing the stories and all that. And it was very, even at a young age, I was like, oh, I kind of see this. But Did you guys experience
You know
when?
what I
When did
first-
you guys experience that?
Well, I first noticed something, and a lot of people still today don't notice it. The weather girl never wearing the same dress. Now, people may not understand this, but until about the 1920s, dresses weren't cheap. They were made, and women would affording a new dress was an event. And then all of a sudden, at the turn of the 1950s, here are these weather girls, and they're never wearing the same clothes twice. And one of the ways that has dramatically altered the culture and created the consumer culture we have today.
I never noticed that.
People haven't noticed how many different ways the culture has been affected by mass media. Because in the day, mass media was going to church. That's changed. Newspapers changed the culture. Radio changed the culture. Newspapers were very dry compared to what they are now. But back in the day, going from newspapers to radio, it changed political campaigns. It changed storytelling. It wiped out half the book industry overnight because people would listen to radio shows. It's amazing how many aspects there are to the culture war, and how many political figures have become cultural icons. And I think that's another reason why we do have culture wars. It's not just fighting to change the culture, but it's fighting to become a dominant figure of the day. In other words, it's pretty much a way of trying to elect the king. So instead of having the most qualified person, which the founders wanted, you get the most popular person.
Right. You brought up the comment about church. Pop culture back then was you go to church. What prompted me to start thinking about this series of videos was a couple weeks ago at church. They were talking about a bridge in South America, the Choluteca. It's a bridge literally in the middle of nowhere, and the bridge was to cover a span where the river was. Well, let's see, there was a hurricane that came through, and it changed the landscape so much that it actually changed the position of the river. So now the bridge sits off to the side, and the river goes way around it. And it just the visual object lesson of the story was about how much culture can shift, and what used to be the norm and what is the structure often finds itself not being used because of the way the culture shifts around, and it goes the bend of the river.
The storm being an outrage mob. Because it's very hard to deal with an outrage mob. The left experienced that in the 50s, trying to change people's mind about war, the glorification, sexual harassment, and racial issues at the time. In the 60s, the right counterculture to rock and roll, the sex, drugs, and then you had the 70s, where you had more polarizing pushback on both sides, where both sides equally made good and bad arguments. And that's what we have in the culture war, however, is a blindness where the polarizing figures don't see their faults. And some of the most polarizing figures in the last decade are nothing actually compared to the 90s, like Pat Buchanan, George Bush. They were far more polarizing than, say, Barack Obama, or statements made by Joe Biden, or even statements by Tucker Carlson. they're the figures today are rather tame compared to the 90s.
Yeah, but because I'd say that because of those shifts, people living in now that didn't experience those aspects or have forgotten them may think that there's a tendency that history begins when your memory does, and you may not know that. I mean, as polarizing as some of those figures were, they're nothing compared to some of the rhetoric in the 50s and 60s, where when you've got people standing in the way of integration and other things. And but even in that turmoil of the 60s in particular, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X actually had a more unifying message, right? They had a less, but if your mindset, your culture is very let's say it's very limited, very small in scope, that's going to sound like a polarizing message. Yeah, the concept of brotherly love is going to sound, if you only love your group and hate everyone else, because that's all you've known all your life, the concept of accepting somebody, whether you agree with them or not, whether you agree with their lifestyle, whether if you agree with what they do, but accepting them first or who they are, that's going to sound like a very polarizing message. So some of it too is how that is being received by the hearer. And that used to be some of the ebb and flow of the culture, and now there's like a very strong force one way that wants it their way and no other way. This is not the first time this has happened. This has happened in this is going on in China and happened in the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and even in
Rome.
even before Rome, right? And whereas in Greece, there was for a long time, even when they were city states, they would have debates about what democracy meant, about how to govern oneself, how this is where the philosophy schools come from, right? We want to build on what we know and kind of explore and turn it on its head and turn it upside down and sideways, and then train the next generation to ask their own questions of anything we might come up with. Right? Not just accept it and go on. No, accept it, understand it, and then learn how to question it. Because you might take the ideas and chop them up into smaller pieces and rearrange it and say, okay, how does this express itself? And when you become standardized, so in our case, standard education, which is a part of the culture, and yes, there's a lot of things with the Rockefellers and others we won't get into, but there was a push to standardize. But one of the consequences, whether intentional or not, is that people were not trained to think. Now, I like Frank Zappa's. I hope it's a quote. I've seen a quote float around the internet that's attributed to him, and I'm not going to quote it. I'll just paraphrase about when we went from civics to social studies. We weren't training people in the process of government and understanding the concepts of self-governance and liberty, and understanding how to question some of those things. And this is just, here's the way it is. And social studies became it's a social contract, and here we're going to learn it. And then each generation has kind of changed what that meant, as opposed to, here are the bounding conditions of society, the framework, if you will. You think of a playground with monkey bars and all these things, right? It's a structure. There are all kinds of different kinds, but the one I like the most was kind of like almost like a cubic. It wasn't a pure cube, but it was cubic in nature. You could go all over the place, right? You could go different paths. You can hang upside down. You can swing. You can do all kinds of things that you want to do. Every child playing on it could do something different, and it wasn't just a swing, right? It wasn't just one thing. It was an item, but kids express themselves different ways in that. And when you get rid of the concept of thinking and questioning and understanding, then it becomes all the same. And then someone who wants to be different is chastised. And I you could, I don't say I believe, but that flow of that idea is what we have in today's culture war, where we have one side who believes they're right 100% of the time, even though they can't tell you what a woman is.
It is man.
And it's everyone else, right? It's not just conservatives or religious people. It's anyone who disagrees with any aspect of what the club believes is a cast off. You know, if you question anything, you're a cast off.
Which goes against their core principles, because when liberalism started way back in ancient Greece, it did exactly what you said. They questioned, they passed on the methodology, their findings, and that's how the scientific method came about, is you pass on your theory and your work and let them find the answer and whether or not they agree with your answer. And eventually, however, it became the liberal world order, where every government has to be liberal. Every government has to follow this framework. And if you study the history of democracy, it died in ancient Greece. It elected a dictatorship. They found the ultimate flaw in democracy way back in the birthplace of democracy. And that trend is what has a lot of old scholars very worried, not about the left or the right, but in the general populace, whether they be left or right, wanting to elect a dictator. And that's happened in history.
Yeah. Well, it's even happened in the 20th century. And I would put forth in the culture of America and the concepts of different aspects of the Enlightenment and other things, that was the core for establishing the culture in America as part of what became the Revolutionary War. And what was missing from the French Revolution and other anti-monarch revolutions in Europe that happened, and the concept of a republic and not a democracy, so that it's less likely. And this is, we want to stay with the culture war, and we can have another discussion on the Constitution at some other time. But this is why senators were not elected by the people. House of Representatives was, but senators were not. And that effect on the culture. So, but that is a change in mindset, right? That's not just a new idea and we're going to write it down. Why that's important and what that means and how it affects the government itself, as well as a person, how when they self-govern, is a culture shift. And so you have, in the lead up to the decades before we get to the revolution, we have Thomas Paine's Common Sense. We have other writings. There's a lot of debate back and forth of various items, and that was a culture war that was trying to change the minds of people that, hey, the sovereign is not the king, the sovereign is the citizen. And that's a huge dynamic shift, that a culture war is, in essence, what was conducted to get people to understand and to come to that idea, to accept it, to question it, right? Hey, Thomas, I read your latest pamphlet, but I don't understand this. And granted, a lot of that was done without his name. And I know there were others who wrote parts of Common Sense. I think it was Thomas Paine, Common Sense, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
At least it published it. But
it was edited by Franklin, and that's where a lot of the addendums came from.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you have Benjamin Franklin, you have Thomas Jefferson, you have Madison, who writes parts of the Constitution. They disagree on certain aspects.
They never all agreed.
Right, but see, that was the greatness of the cultural shift. Is we have some core beliefs that we agree on. We may disagree on its implementation a little bit. We may disagree on its importance, and we have some corollary items that we disagree on, but they're all based and rooted in what we do agree on. And now what we have is chaos in many ways, because we can't agree. Oh, there's, we've invented new genders today, and if you're not up on your list, you're out of the club. No disagreement. No disagreement is allowed. Only 100% compliance, and that is a massive issue.
As
That
we used to call it, draconian.
yeah. Well, it's authoritarian, and
Yeah.
In many aspects, this is what the push against what the American Revolution was about. But it's not necessarily. I don't want to keep coming. I mean, I'm in America. I keep coming back to that, but the idea being that when a cultural war progresses to the point of fewer and fewer people are allowed to participate in it, it has a tendency to fall apart in some regard. So, but that's quite a bit of some historical aspects without going. And like I said, we could probably talk about. We could literally go from pre-dynastic times all the way to modern time if you want.
Yeah, I'm just trying to set the
Yeah.
tone of what we wanna explore and what we want to dive into.
Right.
You know,
So, one of the questions you had, Seth, and I'm going to lay out the question. I'm going to let David answer first because I've been talking too long, because I think we've covered several of those aspects, the impact and different pieces. But so the next question you had down was, what type of outcome do you see now? Like what we're doing now and kind of long term. We kind of want to paint in a wide brush here. I don't believe we're trying to predict. It's just kind of what is the course running going, and I'll let Dave expound on that one.
Well, I think you have three sides. You have the people who love the culture war because it's profitable. You have the people who see the culture war as a way of shifting the culture to them and their core beliefs. And then you have the people themselves who want to be individual. And I think it's always going to, the pendulum is always going to swing. There's always going to be somebody who's going to pull the pendulum for a while, but then their hands get greasy or the people get tired, but it's always going to shift. So you can't predict it. I could give you an example of how the culture war, the greatest impact of the culture war, and actually the way culture was used to change politics, was the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The death of four olds, the old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs. However, if you look at China today, it doesn't reflect any of that. So you could see what I mean by looking at that alone, that the people are going to swing the pendulum, even if there's no words in their mind. They're still going to formulate those actions that go against the ingrained culture.
Yeah, I had a disagreement there. Now I've forgotten it. Well, I would say that the people that are pulling the culture to them, in my view, a subgroup of those who are profiting off of it. But I think you also have a group of people who either aren't aware or don't care. In some circles, they might call these the normies or whatever, but there are people who don't even understand. In my view, perhaps they're asleep or just don't know even what a cultural war is. This is part of what started this whole discussion, and they don't understand that there's changes to the culture that they are actively in that they don't even, it's the boiling pot syndrome, right? They got in, the water was nice and warm, and they don't realize the water's gone up to 180
boiling point.
degrees, right?
Yeah.
And they're about to be cooked, and but I think you get that in any revolutionary aspect. Even during the American Revolution, there were the third, and I've heard these figures disputed, but we'll just go with a third of the people who just were like, "Wiki, you leave me alone." And even now in China with the culture war, the Cultural Revolution, even Cambodia with the killing fields and things, you kind of involve these people because they're out there in the rice paddies going, I'm a rice farmer. grandfather was a rice, the rice farmers for 6 generations. That's all they know. They're out there, and all of a sudden, all these people from the city show up who don't know how to even they're just in the way. And then was it China or Cambodia or maybe it was Russia where they did their
Both.
revolution and they got rid of the farmers.
Yeah, there was both. But both the Chinese Revolution took the farmers and tried to make them steel workers because they needed more steel workers. In Russia, they took half the potato workers to work in the factories. In Cambodia, they got rid of all the teachers and then tried to get the rest of the academics to be farmers. So there was that. They tried to shift the culture by force, whereas I was giving you the answer by those who participate by shifting the culture with words, not by force or non-participation.
Right. No, that's like, again, why this discussion is important, and asking questions to see what the full meaning of something was. But yeah, I would say that I do agree with the concept that I even many times talk about a pendulum that's swinging, and when the pendulum, if you watch it, when it's out on either end, it doesn't look like it's moving, right? Because a pendulum has to slow down completely. Technically, at one point, it's not moving at all in order to swing back the other way. And I would submit that a culture tends to be stronger and last when it kind of hovers around in the middle, almost in a circle, and not swing wildly back and forth. But it doesn't tend to take much force to have a pendulum that's kind of wobbling in the center. It's wobbling around. It goes left, it goes right, it goes this way, it goes that. For someone to come along and go wham and hit it in a different direction. And so I would put in as kind of my addendum to David's answer is part of that. When that swing happens, how people respond is extremely important, because if you have a snapback counter revolution, if you will, then you just replace one murderous regime with another.
The fall of Caesar.
Yeah, exactly. Right. People didn't understand how popular Caesar was. They get rid of him, and then the supporters of Caesar kill those, and it just goes on. And then we end up with Rome ends up with a true dictator, as opposed to one who got a little out of control, but the Senate still had some voice. And then we really got this, maniacal empire and hereditary rule, as opposed to what they had previously.
And plus, you had the concept of the unwilling participant, which we have today. Whether you like it or not, you're the unwilling participant, even if you don't want to participate. Because they, like the Senate, they tried to erase Caesar. They tried to badmouth him, and the people weren't having it.
Yep, unwitting or unwilling?
Unwilling. Sorry.
Okay.
So
no,
the unwitting participant were those who were told that Caesar, was after when the guard were told that Brutus was enacting a coup by the very people who told Brutus to go kill Caesar.
Right. And an expression of this too, for as much as I don't like the Star Wars sequels trilogy, there is an expression of an unwitting participant in Rey, right? She's just getting dragged along with all this, culminating in the second movie where she's like, I don't know my place in all this. She's been in this now for some amount of time, and she's still confused of what she should be doing, because she's an unwitting, as opposed to unwilling. I don't want to be a part of this. It's, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing this, because she just gets swept into something. So what I would say is Luke is an unwilling, gets swept in and says, okay, now I'm a part of it, and expresses. He doesn't ever ask what his part is. He expresses his part. And maybe I got that backwards, but that is a distinction there. And that is a refinement of language too. So,
well, the true one who was always dragged along whose only place was to be there was Chewbacca.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So to kind of sum this, kind of put this in a bow, Seth, the other thing and I was hoping that we kind of did lead into this, is where we possibly be going with all this. I'm going to give my answer first and let Dave kind of wrap it up. But I see. Here's what I'm gonna. I don't want to give an opinion so much as say what I'd like to see, because on one hand we have this complete, the Great Reset, all these things that are a part that are affecting the culture war. If taken to the extreme that some things have been expressed, I mean, it's a horrendous, nightmarish, hellish Earth, right? It's 80-90% of the population dead. It's really bad, right? So we starting to see some signs of people starting to understand how interconnected aspects of the culture are, that what look separate really aren't. And sometimes they're just connected because they're not in a vacuum, and sometimes they're directly connected. And part of what gives me hope that we can pull out of this, the culture is going to it's going to be affected. It can change. And I want to see as a stronger, more individualistic return to it, to the concept of rugged individualism without the manifest destiny bull crap that America went through in the 19th century. And that is seeing Amish go by in their buggies with Trump flags. You have a group of people that are the epitome of, I'll leave you alone, you leave me alone, we have our ways, we understand where you have stuff that we would like to trade for on the fringe, but we pretty much educate our own and grow in our own culture, have all of a sudden taken interest in what's going on around. Never in my lifetime would I thought I would see any kind of political message on any, whether I agreed with it or not, on any Amish caravan, literally horse-drawn buggies. So that gives me a hope that the awareness, but again, I think if we need to have a response that's tempered in love and forgiveness. This is very reminiscent. I understand what they did with Lincoln, but it was very reminiscent of what Lincoln wanted when the Civil War was over. Our friends, our fellow countrymen we want to bring them back into the fold. He wanted a very loving and forgiving reunification of the country, not a horrendous harassment. Unfortunately, right. So he gets shot. Johnson wanted something similar. He gets impeached. And then we get the carpetbaggers from the North. And then the KKK grows out of that as a response. I mean, it just goes to hell in a handbasket for decades, because that love and reacceptance was not there. And
Grant was a drunk.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But right. And yeah, by the time he's a president, I think it really affected him. But that's what I would like to see, is this awareness, this awakening. I don't. Some of the people that are the extremists in this camp, it may take a while to re-educate them. I understand justice still has to be done. I'm not going to just turn a blind eye to things that have happened. But all in all, I would say we need to have an aura of love and acceptance, and with the idea that we want to rebuild on our own, not with the globalist baloney, a stronger culture that is more expressive and is more dynamic, not through forced diversity, not through this phony baloney stuff, but through the actual diversity of thought, differences of opinion, difference of ideas, and an understanding. If we have, we can bring it and discuss those. Most likely, what's really out there is you got 10 people with 10 different ideas, and they all have 10% of the actual much better idea, right? They have to be willing to let go of the 90% of the idea that's bad or whatever, and understand that they helped to build the bigger mosaic, and not be, "Oh, it's my way or the highway." Go ahead, Dave.
I'd like to add that I think a lot of people, whether they know it or not, are infected or mimicking the success of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly on the attacks on old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs. And they see it as that is the way to create a better society. But like you said, they're monolithic. They think they have 100% of the solutions. Whereas, as we've seen with the United States, and we're experiencing that in Australia, we see that somewhat in New Zealand, and that is different regions need their own solutions. And I think the culture war doesn't need to be fought. But there needs to be an understanding that everybody's going to find their own way, that you're trying to teach kids to be better. I'm telling you, you don't need words in your head for bad ideas. You just do the opposite of everybody else. There's this human nature called contrarianism, and then you've got anti-authoritism, etc. So I think the culture war is something that started, slowly. It's building to a momentum, and I see it as if there's no forgiveness, it'll explode like it did in China, in Rome. Even in ancient Egypt, there were, or the French Revolution. I think the best way to fight the culture war is to bring it back to the middle.
Yeah, you spoke on, you didn't think that the culture war is a war that we should not fight on. And realistically, it's not a physical fight. With that being said, some of our questions in our personal interviews coming up throughout the next little bit of this series, you're going to see our ideas and opinions on how to combat the culture war, how we see moving forward our ideas, and what we hope can come forward, maybe as a way to ignite a spark in some people who might listen to this down the road and think, hey, you know what? I have a talent. I can do something. I can do this. I can do that. But yeah, this is a kickoff point. We intend on filling in our own personal thoughts and opinions on this matter, solo and individual. So, do you guys have anything else left that you want to initially say for this kickoff?
Yeah, reconciliation was the word I was searching for. And David helped spark that remembrance. But that was Lincoln's idea. We need to reconcile with the South, bring them back into the fold, become one country again, not punish them for starting this. There's been enough punishment on the battlefield, as it were. No, but and Dave
Right.
picked up on a similar thing, or to the concept of forgiveness is a very strong and powerful idea.
Unfortunately, too many see it as an old idea that they need to punish so that people won't repeat the past. And unfortunately, that doesn't work with some people. They see it as I could get away with it.
Yeah. No, but I look forward to not only taking part in future discussions of this, but listening to the interviews of others. So,
yeah,
and I hope we can find some friends and viewers to take part as well.
Comment
discussions and comments.
Yeah, drop some comments. But yeah, definitely check back with us. We're gonna attempt to do this once a week. Solo interviews. So go on ahead, hit that like button, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, because we want you guys to see future content. I want you to hear what David has to say, and Brian. Tommy couldn't be here tonight, so Tommy will have an interview. I'll do one. We've reached out to several other of our friends who are in the podcast community. They've all agreed they're going to do an interview. So
excellent.
Yeah, it's going to be a good time. Should be a great series of conversation starting. So,
all right.
All right.
Thank
now
you
for the
very much.
self promo.
Yep. Thanks
Check out our
so
links
much.
below.
Yeah, all of our links are down below. Buy David's book because a book a day can give a better life to an author.
Yeah.
Check out Channel Dad. He does some really good beer reviews. And
Yeah.
supplements.
Yeah. I kept my camera off for the most part because my dogs kept pestering me. But I do have. This is a newer double IPA that I will be shooting a review for soon. So I got 2 cans of it. So
Sweet.
my hair's a bit of a mess too. But yeah, up until about 10 minutes ago, I almost thought, hey, I'll be right back. They want OUT again. I'm not going to say the magic O word. But yeah, it looks like I have a little bit of sun time today. But no, I look forward to it. I look forward to the hearing. Being a developer by trade, one of the things that's the hardest thing for develop, and I encounter developers half my age as well as my age who have not been able to do this. Your idea may be the dumbest one anyone's ever thought of, and if you can let go of it and discuss it, you actually may have the seed to the much better idea.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping to do is inspire conversation and bring out people's talent, maybe, hopefully.
Yep.
So.
All right.
Anyways, you guys out there in YouTube land, take care. We'll see you soon, and bye-bye. Check us out on Friday nights for the Pop Culture Corner. We'll all be live. It'll be a good time. Saturday mornings is usually coffee and gaming with me and David because Lape doesn't like to get up that early. Yeah, check us all out. We'll see you guys later. Take care. See ya.